you can't just build a model. You have that understanding, or you have to develop that understanding really fast, because otherwise you're not going to be able to have those sort of conversations with the key people. And sometimes what we're dealing with is really, really specialist stuff.
How do you balance the whole idea of, simplicity with building models when you have a high level of complexity?
If we're going to deal with a really crazy one, particularly with cross guarantees at different levels, we would use that. I think the one thing I will say, though, that isn't.
Vaughan Grandin leads Teneo's financial modeling team and is a chartered accountant with over 20 years of experience in corporate advisory, finance, and restructuring. He specializes in building robust, reliable models for companies in distress, helping corporates, lenders, and investors make critical decisions. Since co-founding the Teneo modeling team in 2021, Vaughan has worked on everything from liquidation analyses for global firms to rapid turnaround models that ensure business survival under intense stakeholder scrutiny.
What are the outcomes to the lenders? And these models called entity priority models, where we try and actually work out what their likely return would be in certain scenarios. If you had one business and the lender had lent money into that business, and say that business had defaulted, the first thing you would know that lender may have the option to wind the business up.
How you think about going into building a model when you're coming into a distressed business situation?
Work that often happens with my team is the adrenaline is kind of real. It's really, really important. So
Financial Modeler's Corner is the world's premier modeling podcast. It is brought to you by Financial Modeling Institute, the world's leading financial modeling accreditation organization. Welcome to Financial Modeler's Corner. I am your host, Paul Barnhurst, aka the FP&A guy. And in this podcast, we talk all about the art and science of financial modeling with distinguished guests and modelers from around the globe. The Financial Modeler's Corner podcast is brought to you by the Financial Modeling Institute. FMI offers the most respected accreditations in financial modeling, and that's why I completed the Advanced Financial Modeler. This week, I'm thrilled to welcome on the show Vaughan Grandin. Vaughan, welcome to the show.
hi, it's great to be here, Paul.
Yeah, really excited. I know I think the first time we had this scheduled to record was 6 weeks ago?
Yeah, I think so. It's
Yeah, and I think you had some stuff come up, and then I did. I think we've rebooked this one 3 or 4 times. So I'm glad we were able to get both our schedules together and make it happen. So thanks for being patient with me. All righty. So let me just give a little bit about Vaughan's background. Vaughan leads Teneo's financial modeling team and is a chartered accountant from South Africa with over 20 years of experience in corporate advisory, finance, and restructuring, helping corporate lenders and investors, often in situations where companies are distressed. He has modeled situations as varied as creating a liquidation analysis for a global automotive rental company, modeling geographic operating scenarios for a subsea construction company, and developing Excel remediation calculators for a UK clearing bank. Vaughan helped set up the Teneo modeling team in 2021 as a supporting business line for the firm's financial advisory practice. Its aim is to create robust, reliable financial modeling solutions, both for clients and to support other teams. The team often supports companies in distress where models or analysis must be created rapidly and withstand stakeholder scrutiny to ensure business survival. All righty, so here we go. First question, tell me that horror story. I'm sure you've seen some models or built some or worked on some that you're just like, how did we ever build this? So what's that worst model story you have for us?
I think there's been quite a few models, as you say, over the years. And probably the one that sort of sticks in my mind a little bit was an airline model. Now, it was the usual horror story. There were lots and lots of tabs. I think this one was about 25. The inputs were all over the place. And obviously what we were trying to do is to support the company with understanding their forecasts and maybe providing some sensitivities to investors. So we needed to know where the inputs were, but then there were hard codes all over the place and something just wasn't right. And it ended up being the corkscrew on the cash forecast. Suddenly the cash number just changed midway through everything. And clearly they had actualized the cash, but it was just, it took a little bit longer than probably it should have to have worked that out. But obviously, the cash changing meant the business was in a completely different situation to what the model was necessarily thinking. And so that kind of hit me hard because obviously the cash is really, really important in a distress situation. So yeah, that was one that scared was kind of scary for a bit. Got to be honest though, the models that are simpler sometimes, where you just go through this model and you end up with hard-coded inputs which are identical to the outputs, they annoy me a little bit more. At least if someone's worked hard to make a model and there's sensitivities and it's a bit crazy, I can appreciate that. But the simple ones sometimes where there's no thought around that are probably more annoying.
I could see that in the sense of you're like, okay, this is an easy model to build and you hard coded in it and you gave no real thought to it. So it's probably more annoying in the sense of you feel like they didn't put effort. Or the other one, they at least put effort, even if it takes you longer to unpick it.
And I think empathy is a word I think about a lot in modeling, because often, particularly in a distress situation, the person building the model has probably got no time, may not even have modeling experience, and they're trying to do the best thing they can in the short time without any real training. And so if you can understand that and appreciate that, then it sometimes means it's a little bit easier not to get too frustrated.
I love that you use the word empathy with modeling, right? Everybody pictures an Excel nerd that wants to spend all day on a spreadsheet. You don't realize the importance of those soft skills such as empathy. How has that helped you? Because I'm sure you're working in very stressful environments when these are distressed companies. Maybe they've already filed bankruptcy or they're close to it and they're working through restructuring.
I think thinking about that human nature behind models is important. And I mean, I helped a client once where the forecast was getting updated, but suddenly the latest forecast was significantly different to previous ones. You could just see formulas were being put on top of other formulas in the same cell, and you're suddenly going, whoa, this is a beast formula. That wasn't there before. But what you could clearly see was that that person was under a lot of stress, and there were suddenly new variables that were coming in that they were needing to take account of. And I think it does help because it means that you can sort of sympathize with them a little bit more, be a bit more supportive. And often doing those sort of things helps you bring build a bond between yourself and the client.
Makes a lot of sense. I am curious. This is a question I always love to see how people answer it because everybody's a little different. If I asked you, how would you define what is a financial model or what you would consider a financial model? How would you answer that?
I think it's quite a big thing sometimes from a risk perspective, between a model and say something like an analysis. For me, a model is usually some sort of quantitative analysis, often in Excel, but it doesn't need to be, where you have sort of predefined inputs. So you've got inputs. You then have a methodology to process those inputs to turn them into outputs. And a good model should be able to take whatever the inputs that you give it and actually use them to create the answer to solve the problem. And I'd say it's as simple as that.
I like it. I like how you kept it kind of simple there of basically, look, you need to have those inputs. You need to be solving a problem. You got to run it through some kind of calculations. All makes sense to me. All right. Tell us a little bit about Teneo and the work you're doing there. I think you've been there for about 5 years now. I think you said 2021 is when you kind of came in to build the team there. What's that been like?
So I arrived in October that year. And I mean, the firm is a global firm. It's a consulting firm. We are there to help, CEOs, CFOs, companies in times of uncertainty and support them. So, the firm has strategic communications. It has investor relations, management consulting, and the team that my team's in, which is financial advisory. And that's really around businesses going through some sort of major event or stress. You could think of that as maybe an equity transaction, a debt transaction. We've got offices in the UK, the US, offshore Asia Pacific, Australia. But in the UK, we've got a really big team, and there's a very strong existing skill set around distress and turnaround. So things from insolvency to helping businesses optimize themselves to just supporting on transactions. Now, where my modeling team fits in that is two ways. So one, we do what a traditional modeling house would do, where we will produce models for clients and deliver them directly. So, if you wanted a 3-statement model, what we spend a lot of our time doing though is supporting the rest of the teams in the business doing their work. So it might be, data manipulation. It may be producing a tactical analysis to show lenders to support a conclusion that we're doing. It may be just producing a model to support a particular transactional event. So we sort of split between those two areas. We do a fair bit of training too, because we're all pretty passionate about Excel and we like to show others about it. So there's a bit of that too. But yeah, it's pretty exciting, and we generally have a good time.
I love how you said we generally have a good time, right? I mean, work sometimes can be tough. Work sometimes can be maybe not fun, but if you're generally having a good time and you're trying to make the best of it, it always goes a lot better. At least that's what I find. It's amazing how much it comes down to attitude.
Yeah, and particularly because we know that we've got. I mean, my team is business consultants too, but we are really focused on Excel, and we appreciate that others maybe aren't as focused. So, very often we've got sort of our own sort of in-house humor and can appreciate things and issues and errors. If we see a crazy formula in a file we get from a client, we just sort of post it and have a chat about it sometimes to unpick it. So there's a real community, which I think is really great.
Right. And that's when you know you're a finance modeler, an Excel nerd, when you start sharing it with everybody else and you're unpicking it and kind of having fun with it. As one guy said it the other day, he found a formula on like row 7,000 in some model, an input. I think it was an input. He said it was like row 7,000. He called everybody over to show him, and he's like, we were rage scrolling. And somebody responded to that, says, tell me you work in finance without saying you work in finance.
There's a lot of crazy things out there.
Oh yeah, we've all seen them, the different things people do. And most of the time they're well-intentioned. It's just people trying to learn and not knowing a better way. I mean, I look back and think of a lot of stuff I built early in my career in crazy formulas in Excel, and I'd be embarrassed for people to see them now. Like, wait, I built that?
I bet you there was a story behind it, and that sort of goes back to that empathy. You might start with just a simple statement, and then suddenly a new variable is introduced. You don't have any space in the model, so you suddenly plug it into the same cell, and
Yep.
then something else comes, and that's why models that are old, that have been going for 5 to 7 years in companies, are generally obsolete, because there's just so much extra formula in them.
Yep. And I think it's two things. It's the last minute trying to do it. And it's, for many people, outside of you start your career in investment banking or M&A, PE, you generally get some good training on modeling. If you start in corporate finance, you really don't get training on how to model. It's just handed to you and you're trying to figure it out and have never been taught. At least that was my experience. And so nobody ever taught me best practice. Hey, separate your inputs, your outputs, your calculations, do this color coding, all those type of things. And so I was just building to survive and get the work done. It's like, all right, somebody needs it. All right, the number makes sense. All right, let's move forward. And over time you start to learn, oh yeah, that probably wasn't a very good way to build that.
Yeah, it's always just that subtle hint to maybe just move your assumptions into an assumptions tab is probably the fundamental starting point. Just makes life so much easier. So yeah, I mean, the struggle is real.
For sure. All right, so I want to jump into a few different models you built. When you and I chatted, you shared some fun things. So one you mentioned is you built a model for a classic car dealership that was a lot of fun. Tell our audiences about that model. What made it unique?
Firstly, it was an interesting job because every other person in the firm at the time, and it was a long time ago, but all the partners were coming into the room to just have a look and see what cars were on the spreadsheet. We're looking at like 1950s Jaguars, Ferraris, Aston Martins. I think they had about 80 to 100 cars, and they were retailing. They were bunched below a million, but it was sort of 1 to 5 million. So, I think there was a famous celebrity had been in one of them. And the problem with the business is that had been underperforming, and the bank was a bit concerned. They were looking, covenants were getting breached. So the business basically needed to create a forecast model. Now, this happens very often when you go into a business. I mean, I was part of an integrated team. There was a lot of people trying to deal with the bank. My role was to produce the forecast model, and the client goes, well, you can't do that. A model can't replicate the business. which is, a common challenge. And then you sort of have to go and ask, well, why is that? And they felt the reason in their business was because of the level of part exchange. So normally, if you're a retailer, you'll sell stock, get cash or debtors. In this business, you end up selling your car, but it was a lot of sort of swapping of vehicles, which seems to be a classic car thing. So, someone might swap a Ferrari for a Porsche, but add in, a couple of £100,000 on it, which is a interesting business model, and maybe part of the reason it was in trouble in the first place. But you're suddenly doing a model where you've not only got to move the stock out, you've got to make assumptions about new types of stock going in. And that led to quite a lot of discussions.
I could imagine the same transaction, you're bringing inventory in and sending it out, and there's a cash exchange.
Yeah. And then you also, because of the nature of the business, that there weren't that many stock items, but they were high value, the way to sort of get the bank, because the main purpose was to get the bank on side, you then needed to work out actually, when are you going to sell these initial vehicles? So I sat down with their car expert, who was very passionate about all his cars, bored me about them for a long time. But we sort of worked out a profile of when each car would likely sell. Now that's, sometimes you think of a model as a whole bunch of small assumptions / lies that you then build up to build a coherent picture. And it was sort of a little bit like that here, that each car had a selling price and had a notional date when it would be sold. Then we looked at it at an individual level and at the portfolio level to see the sales. But then what you sort of had to model it in was sort of work out what cars you were then going to get in after that. And you sort of got this tiering system. So if you sold, 3 expensive cars, you might get 5 smaller cars, and the model worked that out. And then those cars needed to have their own profiling criteria. So you sort of had this inception. And, I was younger at the time, and was it the best way to do it? I'm not 100% sure, but I definitely enjoyed creating these layers of inception of selling the vehicles. And obviously you could flex things like when the car was sold, how much, etc. We presented that to the bank. And I think the thing with the bank they liked about it was, again, you're making a lot of assumptions, but you're making assumptions and thinking about the real drivers of the performance of the business. And the bank liked it and they supported it. So yeah, it was a fun job. I lived the movie Inception for a little while. And yeah, it was nice to look at a bunch of vehicles.
Yeah, and I'm sure like you said, you were the popular person in the office. Everybody wanted to come see your model, which probably isn't usually the case. Not that they wanted to see the work you had done. They wanted to know how much the vehicles were worth.
Yeah, exactly. I think the problem in that case is there'd been so much transacting of the vehicles that the stock value was getting artificially increased because of the stock valuation of the cars coming in. And that was ultimately one of the things that was impacting the business.
Bad financial models can lead to bad decisions or worse. If you want to learn to build better models, impress your boss and your clients, get the Advanced Financial Modeler accreditation. Podcast listeners save 15% on AFM registration. Just use code podcast at fminstitute.com/podcast. Interesting. Yeah, sounds like a fascinating one. And I know, you mentioned they were in a little trouble. They had been breaking some covenants and things. Distressed companies in trouble, turnarounds, that you do a lot of that. So what is it, you like modeling in those situations? Or maybe walk through kind of how you think about going into building a model when you're coming into a distressed business situation.
Well, I think the first thing is that your time level is very, very different to the usual projects. I mean, I remember in 2013 going to Singapore to a $1 billion turnover subsea construction company. So this is a big company. They only had money left to pay either their rent or their salaries for the next month. That was it. So I had to build a model really, really quickly because I needed to get with the team to get the equity stakeholders inside to actually get them to invest in the business at least a little bit more to get it trading. So you suddenly got this time pressure, and it's real pressure. I know we often get artificial deadlines in our work, and no one likes that. Work that often happens with my team is the adrenaline is kind of real because it's really, really important. So time pressure. And often what you need to do initially may not be what the final model is. Another example, last year we worked on a company which had 3 weeks of cash left. We think it had 3 weeks of cash left. It was remarkably burning about $300 million of cash in that time. And we needed to actually know when this was going to happen. So suddenly we needed to build a cash flow really, really quickly. How is it the best cash flow in the world? No, but you needed an answer quickly to at least give people an idea of what's going on, and then you refine it. Normally in a modeling process, you scope everything out, you set everything and begin in a measured fashion. You don't have that luxury here. So those are probably the big issues. And then and obviously you're thinking a lot more about cash, and you're thinking a lot more of your stakeholders. It's not about company management. It's about the providers of the debt, the equity. These are people who are pretty tough, and they're probably pretty annoyed that their investments are in this position. So they're scrutinizing things, and they're sometimes unpredictable. They can ask questions and demand functionalities in what you're doing, which maybe you didn't think of before. So there's this real shift from management to looking at what the lenders need. And that's sort of where we get sort of bespoke models, where we start looking at like what are the outcomes to the lenders. And there's these models called entity priority models, where we try and actually work out what their likely return would be in certain scenarios.
There's a point you made there that I think is important to call out. You often have a lot more people involved in the deal, a lot more stakeholders, especially if there's a lot of different debt holders. Public company got all the equity holders. Now they're not going to all see the model, but there's much more the number of people often that have a stake in this than a new project that there's 2 or 3 investors, or M&A and there's the 2 companies where, they're healthy. So debt isn't involved. You don't have the level. And that gets to the next point, which you mentioned, and I know can get really complex. And I just like you to talk a little bit about it, is entity priority models. You mentioned they're often very complex. They'll require circular references sometimes when we chatted. So maybe tell our audience a little bit more about those type of models and why you have to use them in these distress situations.
I love the fact they sort of exist, because I'm not a fan of circularity. But then you go, oh, these models need circularity. And I think that's kind of critical. If you imagine if you had one business and the lender had lent money into that business, and say that business had defaulted, the first thing, you would know that lender may have the option to wind the business up. So if you start at a single entity and what we call an estimated outcome statement, let's assume we either sell the business or sell all the assets, and then we turn the assets into cash. That cash is then obviously used to pay any costs, and then you have a waterfall. So good fun, waterfall where there might be guarantees, different ranking securities. So then we have to spend time speaking with lawyers. And then obviously everyone will get paid depending on how much cash is there. And you could say to maybe to the lender at the end of it, look, if you wind this business up, you might only get 20 cents in the dollar. It's not maybe, but if you support the business, it's likely you'll get a better return. So that's one business. Now, an entity priority model is more complex because you're dealing with an entire group of companies, and that could be, I've done 120 plus companies in one model. It's you get global groups, and very often what you're trying to do here is not model. You hope the scenario you're modeling isn't going to be what actually happens, but you want to sort of say, if you don't support this deal, the worst case could be this. And there you've got suddenly an interesting thing, because you're doing this modeling for every entity, but you have 2 key differences. One, if there's a profit at the end of selling a business, or you sell a business and then that money goes up to a shareholder. So you've got this interrelationship through equity. The second one on that is intercompany loans. So if one entity owes money from another entity, you then if you did that traditional estimated outcome statement, you'd wind everything else out. The creditor of that company would be the other company, which is then receiving the cash. So that's a function of that wind down. But if you suddenly then extrapolate that across 120 companies, there's all of them are going to be potentially owing each other money. So you've got this interconnected set of events where each the return to creditors from that company will influence all the other company, because it's impacting their outcomes. Does that make sense on that? It's quite hard to circularity is very hard to explain sometimes.
Each entity impacts the next one. It's kind of like, interest, right? Because of the beginning and closing, when you want to take an average, that impacts your final cash. And so you have a circular reference unless you put some kind of breaker logic in it to manage it.
Except in this case, because we actually want to work out definitively what each entity is going to pay to the other ones, you kind of need to just let that circularity run. Now, then there's one more piece on top of it. So you've got the circularity. So we've got, um, I've had models where you've sort of been running circular references 800 times. I've got a colleague who's worked a bunch of them. It's in the thousands. You just have to let the model just sit for a while. But then if you think about the other things, you've got all these returns from the different entities coming in, but then you may well have cross-guaranteed security. And so if you've got, say, I don't know, a security over 5 entities, and say 3 of them are overpaying that entity, you then also have to work out an allocation mechanism by which the guarantee is repaid equitably amongst the companies that can repay the guarantees. So suddenly you've got all these businesses being wound up at the same time, and we do it in one model. They are then repaying each other, but they're also repaying creditors, and we need to make sure they don't overpay those creditors. So all that amidst a very complex waterfall can make things very interesting, but it's really important because what you're almost saying to the lenders and stakeholders is that if you don't support this business, this could be what happens. But then obviously and you may well also go, well, what often happens in these sort of deals is maybe the lender goes, well, I will advance you an additional amount of facility. What will that do on the model? So then you're suddenly using this model to also help the lenders do with their planning to assess their security in future situations. So it gets very, very complicated, and sometimes the outputs of the models are used in courts because you can actually have formal restructuring events where the debt gets compromised, and the outputs of the model are actually used for that. So
Yeah, I can imagine where they settle on 30 cents of a dollar, saying it's better than nothing if these guys go under, or, this one will get them 50 million, everybody else will get this, they'll restructure it all, and everybody's better off than if we just wind it down now and you each get your 12 cents on the dollar or whatever it might be.
yeah, and thankfully the models themselves don't often get interrogated too much, because if you think about it, and you spoke earlier about when I worked on a automotive rental company, if you imagine that model's producing an answer, but probably the most important variable in that is going to be what is the value of all those hire cars going to be disposed of at. So there's a lot of scrutiny around the inputs into the model,
Sure.
as well as also whether actually what we'd call the relevant alternative is whatever it is in the model. So, is it really going to be the entire business is going to wind down, or is maybe you're going to do a slow controlled sale of different assets, and what's that going to do? So it gets quite fun. I mean, I say fun, but I mean, last year, I think we were working on one project, and there was US guys, and they were sort of getting calls, and suddenly scenarios were being expected at like midnight on the model. So it's and then ironically, I was on holiday at the time. It wasn't planned, but the other guy in my team doing it was suddenly 12 to 4 a.m. trying to get the answers to satisfy them, because again, the stakeholders have a lot of power here, so you've got to make sure they're happy.
I'm curious. Obviously, you deal with some really complex models. As you mentioned, 800 circular references, over 1,000 for one of your coworkers. How do you balance the whole idea of, simplicity with building models when you have a high level of complexity, right? 800 circular references isn't simple. I don't care what you've done to the model. So how do you kind of balance the two?
When it looks at entity priority models, we're very lucky that we've developed a template. And so my colleague has a template, which means that if we're going to deal with a really crazy one, particularly with cross guarantees at different levels, we will use that. Otherwise, it's really about getting a methodology and a structured approach. So, everything, if we're looking at 120 entities, it's the simple stuff of making sure they're all aligned in the right places, trying to communicate to get the expectations of what the inputs are is really important, so that what is going to be changed and what's not going to be changed. Now, obviously, that doesn't always work out, but it's good to have that sort of starting point. So I think the really important thing is, yeah, modeling, particularly in distress situations, you need to be able to deal with the complexity, but the user's never going to look at the calcs. And we don't often share models. We share the outputs and the inputs. So actually, the big thing is to make sure that the inputs are in an easy to understand fashion and are tailored to what they need. And then the outputs are also obviously tailored. And that can be graphs, tables, the usual. The complexity will arise. It's just making sure that no one else sees it.
Well, my background is in FP&A. I am also passionate about financial modeling. Like many financial modelers, I was self-taught. Then I discovered the Financial Modeling Institute, the organization that offers the Advanced Financial Modeler Program. I am a proud holder of the AFM. Preparing for the AFM exam made me a better modeler. If you want to improve your modeling skills, I recommend the AFM program. Podcast listeners save 15% on the AFM program. Just use code PODCAST. There's a lot of truth to that. I like how somebody said, I was in Schnorr, when you jump in your car, you don't pop the hood first to make sure the battery's still there and that the engine looks okay. You just press the button and assume it's going to work. They want to see the inputs and outputs. They don't need to see the sausage making. They just want to know it works. And you have a comfort level and you have good structure and processes, right? If you actually opened it up and started bouncing back and forth, especially if you have a messy model, clean is even if you know it really well, but every time you go back and forth between a bunch of different pages and move all over the place, you're just losing confidence, is what I've found.
Yeah, and for avoidance of doubt, we really do mostly actually, we work very hard to make sure our models are, particularly obviously when we're delivering models, that they're following best practice, that there is that whole set of approaches. I think the one thing I will say, though, that is important that we need to get across, and that goes back to my empathy point, and I love telling my team that a good modeler should be a bit like a psychologist, is that you need to be able to make it seem easy, but at the same time, you also need to give stakeholders an understanding of whatever the change they request is will actually do with model timelines. You get guys coming in suddenly going, oh, what happens if I securitize this asset and this entity? And you're sort of going, oh, I can do that, but that's going to cost time. And so it's that balance of being able to, get the job done, but also explain the implications that I think is quite important. And that goes also to a lot of communication. Really important.
Yeah, it gets back, you mentioned earlier, you talk about empathy, communication, managing the stakeholder relationships. So important. Well, I want to ask you about a model that when you and I chatted, you mentioned one of the craziest models you ever worked on was an aircraft leasing model, or I think you said you had a model for every single aircraft separately.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like, it sounds like every time I'm talking to you about a model, I'm looking at every stock item one-on-one, be it cars or aircraft. It's not like that normally, but obviously the
Sure.
more interesting cases are. And I think the aircraft leasing one is a good example of sort of sometimes what happens, and this is purely distressed, but during COVID, you can imagine that the value of aircraft plummeted a lot. People didn't even know when, if they were ever going to fly again. So you had businesses that were really highly leveraged, where the value of the aircraft, or what they call them tails, the value of the tails and the debt was pretty similar starting out. COVID came, suddenly the delta dropped, and I think the debt was out by about $2 billion, like massive number, right? So every lender advised up. So suddenly there's a huge number of lawyers and consultants looking at everything. But the first question was obviously just, how do you get this model built? What's the business plan for this business? What's the forecasts? Let's make it robust and reliable. So suddenly jumping in, looking at the aircraft, looking at their maintenance cycle. So you have these nice calculation blocks of 500 or so aircraft. Then obviously you need to have the ability to add them and sell them and all that. But your first day one thing is not about planning the model, or you're just kind of going, we need to get something to people really quickly to give them an understanding of what's going on in the business. And that was done. But then what sort of happened is obviously there's a lot of complexity there. And then the questions from the various lenders got more and more prevalent, and things got longer and longer, and more functionality got in. It was one of those examples where, because there were so many advisors, there were a lot of questions. And frankly, my colleague and I were working from like 8 in the morning to like 10, 11 at night for a number of weeks, trying to service and update the model. And what happens normally around 8:30, we'd obviously had a very elaborate system of checks and balances in the model. So if there was a mistake, model flash red, you could kind of stop. But by 8:30, suddenly the model started turning red a lot more because we're getting more tired. We're making these mistakes. At least you can see them. So suddenly you're getting in this sort of situation where you're going, the model's turned red. What's happened? And you're checking if you had made the change, or your colleague had made the change. And it was, I mean, that was pre me joining Teneo, but it was really, really intense, because there was so much pressure around that, and the model purpose from just a simple business plan model moving to you're doing LBO, debt structuring, valuation. It got used for so many different things. That the 500 aircraft was the nice part in the beginning. At the end was the ability of this model to like handle debt stacks and the tranches and the changes in time frames of realization and all of that. So yeah, it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, and it's like you said, not every deal are you modeling at a stock level, but some of the most interesting are, because that's a challenge, right? It's those aren't the easier models are, okay, I make an overall assumption for revenue or products, and I move to the next line, and it's fairly straightforward. Maybe you have a page building your revenue schedule. But here, if you're every car or every aircraft, you have a lot of sections kind of building a lot of lines, a lot of schedules to manage all that.
And a lot of data too. The nice thing about it is actually you normally have a good understanding of their maintenance schedules and their maintenance curves, so you can actually extrapolate quite a lot out. It's a little bit like almost a real estate model in that way. But yeah, I mean, again, a model from a long time ago that sort of just stuck in my mind. But there is something really fun, isn't it? But when you get a chance to build a model that you try to replicate the real workings of the business. I sort of call it the model universe. And you have this model universe that tries to replicate reality as much as possible. And you've got these various buttons you can switch. And I mean, that project was weird because we had so many different requests for changes that I ended up having like 2 input tabs. And I end up needing to move the inputs that were actually used onto one tab, and the other one sort of got moved into a second one. I mean, obviously that's nightmare. You just wouldn't normally do that sort of stuff. It's terrible practice. But again, I mean, sort of in this sort of thing, you just needed to try and get the deal out. So I think again another model where, with the benefit of hindsight, I may well have done it differently, but I completely understood every decision I made because of the pressure that was there at the time and the question which was coming from someone to do something.
I love when you have that moment when you can look at a model, make changes, and the business and everybody gets it, and like, "Oh, this is what would happen." Or, you're looking at a new product. I still remember a conversation with a boss where I gave him the new model, and our margin had gone down like 5% for the business overall, even though our revenue was way up. And I had to walk them through all our revenue that you're expecting your sales for is for the new product. I've layered in all the costs. See, the COGS go up to like 80% on this product. Therefore, our margins are going down, even though revenue's up. And it took me a good hour to walk him through, but it all made sense. He got it. He challenged a couple assumptions. We made a few tweaks, but he's like, no, I can really see the business in the model. And those are cool moments when everybody can kind of get it. And then you can start saying, okay, what do we do about it? And have those real strategic discussions of what does this mean? What are our options? Versus everybody going, is the model right? Well, I don't know that I trust this, which we've all been in those situations, and those are never fun.
And you touched on a point that I think's really important around, you can't just build a model. You have to have that understanding, or you have to develop that understanding really fast, because otherwise you're not going to be able to have those sort of conversations with the key people. And sometimes what we're dealing with is really, really specialist stuff. I mean, I was dealing with a group of companies, and we were trying to model the impact of an additional guarantee in one of the companies, but that guarantee wasn't very high on the security net, so it was a low priority guarantee. if you like, and so a lot of creditors came in front of it. We put it in, and then the return to the creditor decreased, and you sort of go, but why is that? And you could walk it through, but you need to take a little bit of time, because what it was doing was diluting the intercompany return to another company that had a much bigger guarantee that was a higher level of security. So actually that higher level of security paid less. And there's a lot around trying to explain that sort of thing and understanding it. And sometimes a model will give you an answer and you go, how did you get that? And then you have to spend a little bit of time thinking about it, because knowing full well that if you don't get it, someone else is going to ask you that question. And that can be quite hard if you've been modeling flat out for a long time, and you then need to step back and look at the number.
I'm the FP&A guy and a passionate financial modeler. When I wanted to improve my modeling skills, I turned to Financial Modeling Institute. Save 15% on FMI's program with code PODCAST at fminstitute.com/podcast. As I like to say, modeling is not a math exercise. If you treat it just as a math exercise, you're going to get yourself in trouble. And I've done that before, and people are looking at it like, this doesn't pass the sniff test. You're like, oh, yeah, I should have thought about that. So I want to ask one more thing, and then we're going to move into our standard questions here. So last year, you co-wrote an article about the core elements of robust financial modeling. And in the article, you had 6 core elements. And I'll list those real quick. And then I'd just like to get your thoughts of how you came up with the list and, your thinking on this. So you had 1, understanding business requirements; 2, scope and design; 3, develop the drivers-based model; 4, communicate regularly and effectively with stakeholders; 5, which I loved, was test, test, test. And then delivery. Kind of, how did you come up with that list?
I think the first thing is I worked with a colleague of mine. So obviously I've had a lot of distress modeling experience. There's a guy on my team, Steve Rupetto. He's worked in just a lot of big 4 modeling before. So actually bringing our 2 ideas together was quite useful on this particular piece of work. And I mean, for me, you sort of almost can split those points into 3 main areas, which is sort of planning. Really make sure you understand the model. And as I say, we don't always have these distress situations. We build lots of models for clients, and it's actually understanding what they want. That's really hard, because most of the time I get the feeling that clients think they know what they want. They don't necessarily know what they want. So you actually have to ask a lot of questions to pull out things, and also unpick the complications which are absolutely inherent in there. So that's really, really important. I think understanding them, documenting them, getting the client to agree, so that way you can set your parameters by which you're going to flex your model. And that's the scoping, designing, putting it in a good document. For me, drivers-based modeling is almost a non-negotiable. I think if you want to produce a credible model, you need to make sure that the real drivers that impact future business performance are understood, documented, and put in the model, and the user has the ability to flex them. So for me, that's really, really important. And throughout this process, as you probably worked out, there's a lot of communication. So I sort of have grouped that in the sort of development phase, but we're doing it from the planning to the end. Testing is so important and sometimes quite difficult. And it's not just you who should be doing the testing. We really believe that the clients should have a good say in understanding and making sure they're comfortable with the model before they take it on, because that point around delivery is important. In the modeling team, we make sure that if we're going to deliver a client model, we have documented it. The client has read the document. They have looked at the model. They should be testing it and comfortable with it and actually sign off and accept that model. So actually say that is something that's fit for purpose that they're going to use. That's a risk point, but it's also meaning getting them involved. So that delivery point you may think is not important, but it's really, 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 really critical. And particularly with nowadays, some of the more complex formulae around there. And I mean, there's a guy on my team, Will, who's been doing quite a lot in these Excel competitions. So he can run really complex solutions, and sometimes we need to use them, but then it's really important that the client needs to understand what they are and why they're there. And we only use complex formula if we need to for a particular reason. And then get them on board and document it and take them through it. So it's very much working with the client, planning, delivering, making sure they're happy.
Got it. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to move into our standard section. And the first question, we ask every guest this question. What is your favorite Excel shortcut?
I like control arrow or control shift arrow. You can move very quickly. It makes you look fast.
Yes, it does. It's much quicker than when you see somebody scrolling down 5,000 rows and you're just like, can I show you something, please? Because we've all seen somebody working that way, and you're just watching it going, this is painful. At least that's what I do. I usually try to just let them work, but there's a point where I'm like, can I just show you a thing or two? So, what is the most unique kind of fun thing you've built in Excel in your personal life?
I think my work sort of intrudes quite a lot sometimes into my personal life. And I think I'm really lucky. I've built some really fun models in my work life or looked at them. So I'd kind of say my work life's got some cool things. I mean, I once had to build a model to assess the safety of like whether a business should financially build a massive skyscraper, which is cool. I think in my personal life, it's boring stuff. It's like spreadsheets for things. I'm in a band, and a couple of years ago, we did a tour of Europe, which is like 21 gigs in 28 days, and there was a good spreadsheet to keep track of everything, but it wasn't very whizzy. But it's kind of cool to think back on.
Yeah, I had someone who had built he had a model for all of his Pokemon cards, what the current value is, what future value, if he sold it at certain points, what the DCF would be. And he had built out this very complex model for every single Pokemon card he owned. And I kind of, laugh. So you hear a little bit of everything, which, that's similar to having to do the cars and the airlines. And you've built some really, I could tell, some cool, complex models in your work life. Yeah. So I imagine the band one was pretty easy in comparison.
Yeah, but I can assure you that if you didn't find the hotel on the night where it was in the thing, you were stressing. I still like the idea of DCF for Pikachu, though. That's pretty cool. That guy built Pokemon DCFs. That's funky.
So there you go. I've heard them all. I had a bathroom tracker, all kinds of different things. Someone who tracked how many swear words were in a TV show. He built an API, and it was taking the text and counting how many, because he wondered, because it swore so much, he didn't want to actually count it. He'd never heard a show swear that much. So he set it up through Excel. Like the things people do. But yeah, so I've had some fun ones. So, all right, we're going to move into rapid fire. So how this works is you don't get to say it depends, but you can elaborate on a couple answers at the end. Because, you could say it depends on all of these. So pick a side, kind of based on your experience and where you feel, a yes or a no. If there's one you really don't want to answer, you get one mulligan. We've started adding that. So you can just say, I'll pass or plead the fifth or whatever you want to call it. And that's how it's going to go. So we'll quickly run through them and then you can elaborate on a couple if you want. Circular references, yes or no?
It has a place. Mainly no, but obviously I've spoken about them a lot.
Yeah, exactly. VBA, yes or no?
Useful, but not necessary.
Do you prefer a horizontal model or a vertical? So you like, lots of sheets, or kind of stack it all in one sheet if you can?
I'm definitely one who likes lots of sheets, particularly nowadays, because you can V-stack things and put them all together if you really need to. But I don't like millions of sheets, but definitely I just don't like scrolling down. It's a personal thing, though. It's a personal thing.
It is. Dynamic arrays in models, yes or no?
Man, they're awesome. It's very much a yes, but you need to use them properly.
And so here's my next question with that. Do you think we should be building fully dynamic models where you're trying to do dynamic arrays through the entire model with everything?
No, but I think it's a bit like AI. You go, can AI do anything? You go, no. Could it do it in the future? Maybe. I think that you need a really high skill level to pull off a full dynamic array model, and I don't think it's needed.
That's
but
fair.
I'm not ruling it out. I think people should be open-minded about these things.
All right. Yeah, I have a similar philosophy as you. External workbook links, yes or no?
It was great in the 2000s, but now, no, definitely not. No.
Named ranges, yes or no?
Yeah, particularly because you can make them dynamic now. It's a game changer. Dynamic name ranges are the bomb.
How about formal standards? Do you follow like a formal standards board like FAST or SMART or any of those in your modeling?
Yeah, as a modeling team, we've developed our own, which basically sort of takes them. But yes, very much so.
Do you think financial modelers should learn Python and Excel?
It's well, should's a strong word. I don't think they have to.
Okay. What about Power Query?
More useful, so yes,
What about Power BI?
is very useful, but you can also create dashboards in Excel. So I'm going to go, no, not necessary, but it's a nice to have.
How about this? This is always a fun one to see what people say. Will Excel ever die?
No, well, I'm going to go and say not in my lifetime, but not in our lifetimes for sure. I mean,
Yeah. I get that answer from time to time. And my favorite is one person said, yes, just I'm praying it's not in my lifetime. So, do you think AI will build the models for us in the future?
probably about the same time that we're going to send spacemen to like far off galaxies kind of thing. Don't think very soon in the immediate future, mainly because you've got to ask people questions to understand what's going on. So no, I'm more on the people side on this.
Do you believe financial models are the number one corporate decision-making tool?
I'll put them number 2 to just the simple concept of a business meeting. Bringing people together and talking about things to me is the number one way to get proper decisions done, that communication. But it's obviously very hard.
Okay, makes sense. What's your lookup function of choice? What's the lookup function you like to use the most?
Oh, filter. Love filters. And I can put a unique in front of them, a sum, a count day. I'm a filter guy.
You and Mark Proctor. That's his favorite as well.
It's very intuitive. I think that's the thing is you can explain an X lookup to someone and there's commas. With a filter, you can go, this is what you want to pull. This is the question you want to answer. And you can have multiple questions. I really like that ability. It's a bit more intuitive to someone new to lookup functions.
See, I feel like it was just funny when I train, I feel like XLOOKUP is a little easier for most people that I'm training. And that's probably because, you know, a lot of people I work with don't understand Boolean logic. And so they kind of get confused of how they have to write the formula. But if you understand the basics of Boolean, filter's very, very straightforward.
I think, I mean, we start with X lookups as the thing that we teach most people, but we'll always try and just teach a filter also, because some people just work to it better. In my mind, it's a lot more, makes a lot more sense. But absolutely, if I was going to teach it, X lookup first.
Okay, yeah, just curious, kind of your take, because that's the one thing I run into. But yeah, I much prefer teaching XLOOKUP over VLOOKUP. Like it makes so much more
Did you learn on
sense.
VLOOKUP though? That's the question. Did you start your career with a VLOOKUP?
I did. I started with VLOOKUP, then index match.
The VLOOKUP, that obviously it's the comma thing and then putting false on at the end. But you know, when I remember I was in audit in South Africa a very long time ago, and I was like, this was uncovering some secret that people just couldn't do, and that was kind of cool, and that probably got me into everything. I'd use index matches, and they have a purpose, but VLOOKUP and then XLOOKUP. I mean, sometimes I might drop a VLOOKUP in a formula just for nostalgia purposes and to annoy members of my team who are more XLOOKUP fiends. But you've got to start somewhere, right? It's like your gateway. It'll always be there.
The lookup functions, whether you start with VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, it really is kind of that gateway to becoming more advanced in Excel. Because it's when you realize lookups can take something that would take you hours to do manually and reduce it to seconds. And that's just the
Absolutely.
game changer when all of a sudden you realize that savings that can happen. And then you're like, what else should I be doing that I was doing manually before? Am I wasting hours? And you start digging in and all of a sudden kind of opens up that world to Excel for a lot of people is what I've found is that just learning the basic lookup, whichever one it is, if it's VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, index match, filter, whatever, choose, they really just kind of open a world for you.
Obviously, they're joining things together, but they bring pieces of data together to tell a story. And I think particularly in like the world of dealing with companies that might be in distress, you need to bring pieces of information together to support and evidence a story. And so that important thing of taking people on the journey and bringing that information together is, XLOOKUP is great. But I'm still a filter guy, first and foremost.
That's all right. We'll let you have your filter. We all have our formulas that we love. Well, Vaughan, I think we're right at time here, but I want to just take a minute and thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been a lot of fun. I think our audience will enjoy it. And I know you get to go do some singing with your bandmate, get to perform. So enjoy that this weekend. And thanks again for just carving out an hour of your time to chat. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. I mean, I think what you're doing with these series of podcasts is absolutely fantastic to turn a community about something that is your job and make it a little bit more passionate. It's fantastic. And it's great what you're doing. And I'm very honored to be here.
I'm lucky to get to interview you and so many others that do the hard work in the community. And so thank you for sharing your knowledge, and you have a great rest of your day. So thank you, Vaughan.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time. Cheers.
Cheers. Financial Modeler's Corner was brought to you by the Financial Modeling Institute. This year, I completed the Advanced Financial Modeler certification, and it made me a better financial modeler. What are you waiting for? Visit FMI at www.fminstitute.com/podcast and use code podcast to save 15% when you enroll in one of the accreditations today.